in either case, we are going to proceed now with the content. So hopefully you see the primary slide on the screen, and I just went ahead and changed that slide. So if you did not see the slide change, then something may be wrong. But hopefully you are tracking with me now. Oh, and I appreciate already using that chat room. That's fantastic. As I mentioned up front, when we talk about exercises and when you see exercises in the lecture slides here, we're generally going to push those off towards the end of the session once I'm done lecturing on a particular topic. Today in particular, the first session in this first section, we usually provide ample time for students to get their labs set up. And the assumption is that you've received, hopefully, the SANS thumb drive, the reverse engineering thumb drive that has, for example, your VMs, your REMnux VM, your Windows VM, and you should have also received a Windows license. If you don't have that data yet, then please let me know, and after class we'll have to figure out how to get that to you as soon as possible. But the way we're going to run today's class is rather than providing that time up front, which is what this slide says, we're going to wait till the end of class, and at that time I'm going to be here on the chat in order to provide any help you need in setting up your virtual machines. Now the exercises specifically that you're going to use to set up your virtual machines are located in your workbook, which hopefully you also have. And exercises 1.1 and 1.2 really go pretty in depth into how to set up both REMnux and your Windows REM workstation. Now one note I want to make up front, because I do get this question a lot, is regarding REMnux. Now you may have noticed that Lenny recently released REMnux version 6. That was about, I want to say, about a month ago. And for this class, we are actually going to be working with version 5. And the reason is that since version 6 is so new, the course content is still being updated. And so the screenshots you see, a lot of the tools you'll see, all that is assuming you are working with version 5. In addition, the version that we've provided you on the thumb drive, it has the malware on the Linux virtual machine. If you download REMnux online, you won't have the malware within the virtual machine. And lastly, we've also defined a number of environment variables within REMnux that are going to be helpful as you go through these exercises. And so if you're using the publicly available version 5, or if you downloaded version 6, you can certainly do a lot of these exercises with that, but what you'll find is you may not match the screenshots, and you may not match some of the voice track. So I do see a message here that some people did not receive the package yet. We'll certainly follow up with you afterwards to try and see what the deal is there, and make sure you get that as soon as possible. So thank you for sending me that message. All right, so we're going to continue past the slide number 2 here, and we're going to move now into an introduction to malware analysis. Now, many of you are on this call probably because you're interested in malware, and so you know a little bit about it, but we want to make sure that we're moving forward together, that we are using the same terms when we talk about malware, and that we just define the scope of this class as well to kind of set your expectations so you know what's coming next. But to start off with, I'd like to spend a little bit of time just kind of defining precisely what we're going to be dealing with in this class. So when I say malware, we're really talking about anything that causes or intends to cause a computer system harm, right? We're going to use a pretty broad definition of malware. But more than that, right, it's really a tool that the attackers are using when you consider people trying to infiltrate our networks, whether you work for an organization or you provide that support to other organizations. These are really the tools that attackers use against an organization to accomplish their goals, to steal data, destroy information, or even modify sensitive data. So whatever those goals are, from an organization's perspective, they usually have pretty high impact. And so if you're combating this adversary, you really do need to understand their tools. It's a very important step towards the path of determining the overall risk that you're exposed to, and that's what the security game is really all about, accurately measuring risk. And even more importantly, in many cases, as some of you may know, those of you who actually perform incident response, the goal often is to find malware. People are spending tons and tons of money buying appliances and software to find malware. But in the end, if you don't have people on your team who can actually understand how this malware works, then it's going to be really hard to actually provide value. It's going to be really hard once you actually find that malware to assess what it's doing. Now, most absolutely there are tons of products out there that can help move you in that direction, but one of the things we're going to emphasize in this course is the criticality of understanding how to manually analyze malware, not just click a few buttons and get output from a tool. Because many of these tools, don't get me wrong, they're extremely valuable, right? They provide very helpful data. But that's what they do. They provide data. You still need a human to actually digest and process that data and apply risk to it to actually communicate it to, for example, the C-level suite. And we all have managers that we probably report to, and they're unlikely to understand assembly code, right? And so we need to somehow take that information, that low-level technical content, and translate it into something that our managers will understand and that will actually allow us to impact the organization at a higher level. I also want to define a little bit of terminology. Now, in many cases, you may have heard of people talk about malware analysis versus reverse engineering. In this class, for our sake, we're essentially going to use those terms in a very similar way. Now, some people think of malware analysis as a more basic approach to reverse engineering. Some of the content we'll discuss today, to some of you who have been exposed to this topic before, might come across as a little bit basic, and that's because we want to provide that solid foundation for everyone. But what you'll see quickly is that we get pretty advanced in the coming sessions, and in my opinion, that definitely falls into the realm of reverse engineering. But these are just terms that are very loosely defined, and so for the sake of this class, we're really not going to worry about using one versus the other, and we'll use them fairly interchangeably. Now, I've already talked quite a bit I got on my soapbox in the previous slide about the importance of performing malware analysis, how it helps you assess the impact of a particular attack, and most importantly, how that helps you scope out the remediation. Right? So when you have a deep understanding of malware, not only will you be able to assess the potential impact of an arbitrary sample, but when it comes to the actual cleanup process, and let's be honest, at this point, every organization is going to experience an attack that typically involves malware. That cleanup process can be very complex and intricate, and without the knowledge of all of the artifacts and different system activities that a malware causes, it's going to be really hard to clean that sort of thing up. And that's why learning how to perform reverse engineering at a low level can also be very helpful, because it equips you to very quickly, efficiently, and accurately kind of deal with and remediate an ongoing attack. And I think you'll find that it feeds into that overall incident response process fairly well. Now, when we talk about malware analysis, there are most definitely varying degrees, and what I mean by that is there are various levels of effort that you could apply to the problem. So we have this kind of a pyramid here, and I'd like to start off at the bottom, at fully automated analysis. Now, I've already touched a little bit on what that means. If, for example, you have access to a FireEye type product or a threat analysis type product, there are a variety of automated sandbox engines out there. That's really what we're referring to when we talk about fully automated. You upload a file, you click a button, it runs it in perhaps some customized VMs, and it outputs a bunch of data. Again, those are very helpful capabilities, but that's not really what we're going to get into in this class. We're not here to train you how to click a few buttons or read a user guide. We're here to train you how to actually perform this work manually. So even if you got a $200 budget as opposed to a $200,000 budget, you'll still be able to perform this work, and you'll be able to perform it well. You'll be able to answer the hard questions as you draw out of these large chunks of data. What does it all mean? So a malware specimen changes a registry key. What does that mean? One of these fully automated tools might tell you that it's impacted the registry, but it's up to you as a human to really assess the impact and the importance of that data. So that's really what we mean when we talk about fully automated. We're going to spend the rest of our time on what's above that in the pyramid. We're going to start off with static properties analysis. When we say static properties analysis, we're talking about learning what we can about a file without actually double-clicking on it. You may be surprised to find out that you can actually learn quite a bit about an executable, for example, without ever executing it. You can look at, for example, strings. You can try and determine if it's obfuscated. You can look at such things as the version information, and all of these can be very helpful pieces of data that feed into your development of hypotheses. And I'm going to bring up hypotheses pretty often during this class because reverse engineering is really about developing hypotheses and then trying to prove or disprove those hypotheses. So maybe when I'm looking at the static properties of a file, for example, maybe I'll look at the strings contained within an executable, I'll see a reference to HTTP. Well, if I conclude from that evidence alone that a malware specimen is engaging in HTTP for command and control, that would not be a very good approach, right? I need to actually prove that that's happening based on that observation. And so that's why static analysis can be very helpful, because it gives you key questions that you can then proceed to answer with the rest of your analysis work. When we get into interactive behavior analysis, that's when we're actually going to execute the code in order to measure its impact on the file system, in the registry, across the network, and in memory. But I want you to key in on that word interactive. So we're not just sitting back and watching this thing do its thing in a virtualized environment. We really are going to work on interacting with the code to facilitate activity. If, for example, it's looking to connect to a web server, we may not want to actually let that sample connect to the internet because, well, the attacker might be alerted to our analysis activity. But with our virtual environment, we might consider starting up a web server and convincing the sample essentially to reach out to that web server instead. So we're going to iteratively really discover what the sample is looking for and try to provide it with the environment it needs. The goal there is to convince the sample that it is in fact in its intended target environment. That's what we're doing with interactive behavioral analysis. And finally, the deepest level that we'll go to is manual code reversing. At that level, we're going to typically use a disassembler to actually look at the assembly language associated with a code sample. We're also going to explore how to use a debugger to execute each individual instruction. And at that very low level, we're in a very powerful position, because in that case, we truly do control how the malware is executing. We tell it specifically what instructions to execute, and we're even going to go over some examples where we literally patch the code to change how it executes. And we'll come to see why that's of a pretty important advantage to us. So just to scope out the class a little bit, we are primarily going to focus on Windows executables. And we are going to focus almost exclusively on 32-bit executables. And we do often get the question, well, what about 64-bit? Why aren't we looking at 64-bit? At this point in time, personally as an incident responder, that's what I spend most of my time doing, it's very rare to see 64-bit malware. Now, of course, if you've been reading a lot of the APT reports from Kaspersky, for example, you may have noticed that a lot of those samples are 64-bit. So when you're dealing with extremely sophisticated cases, it's absolutely true that malware does show up in 64-bit. However, the fact is that the lowest common denominator at this point is 32-bit system. If I'm a malware author and I'm trying to hit a bunch of systems, I'm probably going to go with 32-bit because I have the highest likelihood of success. That way, whether it comes across a 64-bit or a 32-bit system, my code will still run. And so at this point in time, most of the malware out there is still 32-bit. But of course, I expect that to change. And in the next couple of years, we probably are going to have to start focusing more on 64-bit malware. The purpose of this course is to prepare you to handle the large proportion of cases, as opposed to those small 1 or 2%. Now, like I mentioned, those 1 or 2% can be very important when you're talking about an advanced threat attack. But starting off with 32-bit is a very good way to begin your adventures in reverse engineering. And you also discover a plethora of samples on the job or as a hobby that you can use to really enhance your skills. And in the coming days, we will also touch on 64-bit, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the differences between 32 and 64 just to kind of prepare you for that next step. However, we do recognize that Windows executables often land on a target system as a result of some sort of a browser-based exploit or other interaction. And so we are going to talk about browser-based malware. We're also going to get into malicious documents such as Microsoft Office and PDF, because those are often the medium that allows the malware to actually be delivered to a target system. Now what we have here is on your screen is the SANS Forensics curriculum. And to some extent, you may view this as yet another advertisement for SANS and the classes we offer, and to some degree, you're absolutely correct. But I also view this as a good reminder about the role that malware analysis plays. So oftentimes, our story as a malware analyst, and that's kind of the hat we're wearing right now, right, regardless of perhaps what you might do all day long, but as a malware analyst, we really do have to consider where we are getting information from, where these files are coming from, and how we're working with other entities. Because in reality, when you get a malware sample, well, it's going to come from somewhere. Perhaps it'll come from a potentially compromised machine. Perhaps you're working on this case as part of a larger investigation, and you got people performing disk forensics. You have people performing network analysis, and then there you are performing malware analysis. And you have to work together with these people to really accelerate all of your analyses efforts. What's going to become pretty clear is that when you're performing reverse engineering, the more context you have, the better. And even within reverse engineering, you're going to notice that we're going to constantly try to inject content into what we're doing. Because if, for example, you're taking a look at a file and you start to understand that it's actually looking for another file across the file system that for one reason you just don't have access to, well, in the context of a real investigation, you might then go to your forensics team and say, hey, listen, I've been reverse engineering this malware sample, and it appears to be looking for a certain file that I don't have access to. And so now you kind of have that synergy going on, you're sharing information, and you're using the context perhaps from the forensics group to actually drive your reverse engineering. So while our story will all often begin with a file being handed to us, right? Now we got to reverse engineer that file. It's very important to understand the context in which we're performing that analysis and where that output is going to go. And we're going to talk more about that as well. So as all good lessons do, we're going to start off with a story. And in this story, well, this may be a story you're familiar with, depending upon where you work. We are working, let's say, as part of an organization, and we have an admin who's come up to us and says that he or she is seeing some suspicious behavior from a particular machine. In this particular case, that admin proceeded to look at the box live and noticed an unusual process, srvcp.exe running. They also noticed, after looking at some basic network information, that there appeared to be an outbound connection to port 6667. Of course, this is probably no surprise to most of us here on the line. Antivirus was perfectly fine with this activity and had no issue with the file itself. But this admin knew a little bit about malware analysis and decided to actually take this file and do a quick static test. They just ran a strings program against it. And at the bottom of your screen is the output that they saw. They saw strings referring to a spawning FTP, something about ready and willing. I mean, a question might be ready and willing to do what? So this is clearly kind of odd behavior. What you might also recall, 6667 is associated with IRC, not a protocol that's used as much anymore, but is certainly something that you might key in on. Now, for those who aren't familiar, IRC is essentially a network of linked servers that allows users to hold real-time online communications. And essentially how it works is a user can log in to a particular IRC server. They can join what's called a channel, and then they can start communicating with everyone else who's on that channel. They can essentially send messages to the central server, and that message is then distributed to everyone else connected to the channel. So just by that very description alone, you might start to see why it's such a good vehicle for command and control. Because when a bot master, for example, is trying to control a series of bots, that's exactly what they want to do. They want to be able to send one message that gets distributed to all these different bots. And so IRC is actually a really good protocol for doing that. Now these days, IRC is not seen as much in a corporate environment, and so it's not necessarily the #1 protocol that attackers turn to for command and control, but it is a really good way to get introduced to this topic simply because the protocol is built for this sort of activity. So getting back to our example, the admin noticed that srvcp.exe kind of put the pieces together, and not only did it appear to be using IRC, but looking at the network traffic, which in this case was not encrypted, the bot appeared to be using specifically the channel MicahG and the real name field I'm Trojaned. Right? So let's specifically focus on the channel here. As I mentioned, a channel can be joined, and users can all talk with one another about a particular topic. So the channel here is MicahG, and that's something that we're going to want to keep in mind. So this leads to many questions, and as I mentioned before, it's all about hypotheses and questions. The more questions you can come up with as you perform malware analysis, the more focused your effort will be. Malware analysis is one of those things where you could literally spend months and maybe even more on a particular sample, but very few of us have the flexibility to actually do that. And so the way you proceed is by asking yourself the right questions. For example, in this particular case, just the very basic question of, well, what is this sample doing? I mean, I know it's engaging in IRC, but why? What sorts of commands is it receiving and sending, right? Those are some basic questions you might ask, and that could be the starting point of your investigation. You certainly want to better understand the attacker's goals in this case. What are they actually trying to achieve? And then eventually you would want to translate all that technical information into risk, because like I said, it all comes down to risk. I find the sample on my network. What risk does it pose? What's the impact that it may have had? And how can I go about remediating the situation? These are all the sorts of questions that we're going to answer as we perform reverse engineering. So in order to get started here, I'm going to introduce a few key concepts. Now, the two basic approaches we're going to take to analyzing a sample like srv-cp.exe in this case is one, behavioral. Right? I mentioned behavioral analysis is when we actually execute a piece of code in order to understand its impact on the file system, in the registry. Does it spawn processes? What sort of network traffic does it create? I want to essentially know how it behaves, and I'm going to do what I can as the analyst to allow it to breathe and essentially be as bad as it can be. The other type of analysis that I would often perform is code analysis. Right? So based on my behavioral analysis, that could give me some helpful indicators of compromise, but I want to go deeper, right? Because perhaps there's activity or potential in the code that hasn't revealed itself in behavioral form. And that's really the power of code analysis. When you're performing behavioral analysis, when you double click on a sample, for example, you can learn quite a bit about it. But there are always variations in execution activity. There are dependencies in your environment, perhaps, that'll cause the code to act one way versus another. And so when you get down to the code analysis level, you can really push aside those decision points and understand everything that a sample might be capable of. And that's when you really get into reverse engineering malware. It gets pretty fun, but we'll talk more about that in the coming days. So in order to actually do this sort of work, right, before we even double click on a file, we obviously need to make sure we're doing so in a safe manner. And so one of the steps we'll take is to make sure that, one, we have an isolated lab, and that's why we're distributing these virtual machines to you, so you have these environments, these protected environments that you can analyze code in. We want to make sure that the lab we're using is fairly isolated. So the VMs we've provided you, hopefully you have maybe another machine outside of your production corporate machine that you can run them on, because although the code we've provided you with, the malware, we understand exactly how it works. Unintended things can always happen, and so it's best to make sure that you're only executing that code within your virtualized environment, and even that your virtualized software is on a machine that's essentially expendable. When you do work on malware in the wild, then you're in a really unpredictable state, and it can be fairly dangerous to start doing this sort of testing on your production systems, because in the worst case, even if it's just a slight bit of user error where you double click on a sample outside of a VM, it could have catastrophic impact if you're connected, for example, to your corporate network. So really important to keep safety in mind when you're performing reverse engineering. The other benefit of kind of working in this controlled environment is, well, you control all aspects of it. So you can have all your cool tools installed, ready to go. You can use something like VMware, which is hopefully what many of you have at your disposal, to take snapshots and remember various states of your analysis process. All of that is extremely helpful as you start analyzing malware. And so having that kind of tight environment that we have control over will really kind of accelerate this process. And malware is already fairly unpredictable, right? So you want to have as much in your control as possible as you move forward. So this is just one example of what your lab might look like. You might have a Windows 7, Windows XP, Linux 8.1. For this class, we are providing you with a REMnux Linux virtual machine. And we're also providing you with a Windows 8.1 license so that you can use the Windows VM that we've distributed. Now, I think you're going to be a big fan of that VM. It's got all our best tools built into it. Most of them are freely available. That's kind of the point, is to provide you with a toolkit that is freely available, that doesn't cost you tens of thousands of dollars. And I think you'll find that to be very beneficial. But if you're doing this work as part of an organization, you're going to want to make sure that you have some VMs that are similar to the similar to the machines on your enterprise. because when you're trying to assess the impact of running code, well, your boss is going to expect you to try and tie that back to the enterprise machines that are part of your organization. And so if your organization runs primarily Windows 7 64-bit, I would highly encourage you to also have a Windows 7 64-bit malware analysis environment so that you can understand what would happen if certain code ran on a target machine in your environment. So having that kind of variety is very helpful. And even within these VMs, you could create snapshots of different states of patching. So maybe you'll have a completely unpatched Windows 7 machine just to see, hey, if I run this piece of code, how bad can it really be? I mean, if I'm not protected by these patches, is it capable of more activity? Because it's a very kind of explorative process when we're trying to determine what a sample is doing. And so having a variety of environments, that includes a variety of operating systems, a variety of applications, can be very beneficial. So kind of touched on some of these topics already, but one of the reasons we're using virtualization is so that you can have this variety of guest machines to choose from as you analyze malware. If, for example, you're looking at a Windows 7 VM, you run a piece of malware, it does nothing, well, you might try just running it on XP. Maybe it's a really old piece of malicious code that was targeting XP, and on 7 it just doesn't work properly. And so when you have this variety of VMs ready and available to use, it gives you the flexibility to very quickly do some of that testing. This is just a screenshot showing essentially what VMware looks like. This is probably something you've seen by now. Hopefully you've already installed VMware. Now there are certainly other virtualization products on the market. Maybe you're using VMware Fusion, by the way, so Workstation or Fusion, they're both fine. But this class is focused on using VMware. It's one of the few commercial products that are actually required for this class. VirtualBox certainly is another option, but it's simply not as mature as VMware. And so for the sake of standardization and to make sure you can get through all the labs, we highly encourage you to use a VMware product like Workstation or Fusion. Now, when we're dealing with this virtualized environment, one thing we haven't really touched on is this notion of malware being able to escape your VM. Now, it's certainly not often that sort of incident occurs. There have been vulnerabilities in the past that have allowed malware to do this. Certainly, none of the malware we provide you with will actually try to escape your system. But just as a precautionary measure, it's always good to make sure that your VM environment is fully patched. And again, like I mentioned before, that you're not really using that physical system for other reasons. I wouldn't use the physical systems ideally for corporate email or anything else, really serious. Of course, some people don't necessarily have, 3 or 4 machines at their disposal. So, for example, I would just make sure you've logged out of, your Gmail account, your Facebook account, and your LastPass account, or whatever other password system you might use. Just kind of make sure all those things are logged off at least on your physical system. So in the worst case that something happens, even if you double-click something, it doesn't turn uglier than it has to be. This slide just touches a little bit more on some of the possibilities when it comes to malware that will actually fight against you. So we're actually going to see some cases here of malware that tries to detect your analysis activities, right? And it's a little scary to think about because we're using all these tools to monitor malware, but the fact is attackers know that, right? I mean, if you consider the set of 10 to 20 common tools used for malware analysis, well, it's really easy for an attacker to understand what those tools are and how they work, what they're called, and some of the impact that they have on a system, right? All these tools, when we install them on a Windows virtual machine, they leave their own footprint, and those are artifacts that malware can detect, and they can use that information to make decisions as to how they're going to execute on that system. So that's why we really do spend quite a bit of time talking about malware in this class at a very low level. We expose you to trying to evade your analysis efforts. And it's very important that you be exposed to those cases, not because we expect you to actually face those exact samples, right? It's nearly impossible to expose you to every potential case that's out there. But we want you to get in the right mindset. We want you to understand that if malware is acting odd or appears to do nothing at all, that may just be on the surface, that you're going to have to dig deeper to really truly understand how it's working, what sorts of decision points it's hitting, and how it's making those decisions. So you may have malware, for example, that automatically terminates when it detects that you're running a tool like Process Monitor. You may have malware that, frankly, in the more dangerous case, actually changes its behavior based on your analysis tools. Frankly, I prefer when the malware just terminates if I'm running a tool, because then I at least know something's happening. What's scary to me is if malware starts doing something different because it detects that I have IDA Pro open, right? That's scary to me, because I may not realize that for quite a while until I dive pretty deep into the code. We're also going to expose you to samples that just interfere with your analysis tools. And so all that makes our job very difficult, but we're going to work through systematically how you can encounter those situations and really overcome them with confidence. So there are a number of strategies you could use when you're dealing with malware that attempts to essentially fight back, right? That's trying to detect that you're analyzing it. In the case that it detects your virtualized environment, for example, maybe it's going to look at the registry key associated with VMware, right? If you look into your 8.1 VM, you're going to find under HKLM software a registry key called VMware, and there's some malware there that looks for it. Well, in that case, perhaps you could just run on a physical system. Maybe you could just, maybe you have a sacrificial laptop, maybe your company has one, and you can just run the code on there. That's fine, that's one approach. You could also tweak the VMX configuration file associated with your VM. Ed Scotus has written a paper on that, and it is going to be in your slide notes. And it does work. The problem, however, is that it really slows down the performance of your virtual machine. So it's really is far from ideal. Another approach is to actually modify the code. I briefly touched on this earlier. You can actually patch the code so that maybe you'll just essentially wipe out the code that's actually checking for certain analysis tools. We're going to talk about how to do that, how to actually change behavior as we go through some of the difficult samples in this course. Now, when you're using a VMware or another virtualization product, snapshots are going to be incredibly helpful. If you haven't been exposed to snapshots before, I think you're going to be a huge fan. Essentially, using VMware, we can snapshot the state of a machine, perform some analysis, change the current state, and then just hop back to that previous state. That's very powerful for us because we can snapshot our known good system with all of our tools built into it, and then we can expose that system to malicious behavior. And then when we're done performing some analysis with our monitoring tools, we can then hop back to that known good state. In addition, sometimes when you're performing analysis, you go pretty deep into the code. And what I mean by that is you might, for example, be looking at the assembly instructions and you start following a variety of branches. Before you know it, you're not even sure how you got to where you are, but you know that you need to keep moving forward. Well, in those cases, it might be helpful to also take a snapshot. That way, if you encounter some sort of an error or the program crashes, you can also just revert to that snapshot and continue your work. So snapshotting is something that we're going to use pretty heavily. Now, it does take up disk space, right? So you're going to need to have that in order to do it. But you'll find that to be pretty critical to performing efficient malware analysis. Now, if you choose to do so, you could do this work on a physical system, and you could restore a physical system, right? There are a variety of solutions that will allow you to do that, such as Ghost or Clonezilla. However, they do take some time. For me, they're not preferred. I'll really only go to the extent of running malware on a physical system if during my reverse engineering in a virtualized environment, it becomes apparent that I'm missing something, right? That in some way the malware is detecting my VM, I'm unable to bypass it by patching the code, or I'm just limited on time, right? Maybe I only got a few hours to look at the sample. It becomes very clear that it's doing nothing in my virtualized environment. Well, in that case, I'm going to hop over to a physical system because I'm trying to assess as quickly as possible what this code does. And so there might be some reasons that you want to go to a physical system, which is why it's helpful, if you're budgeting for this sort of thing, to have a sacrificial machine that you can just load operating systems on and wipe or ghost, whenever you need to do that, whenever you need to take your analysis to that step. Now there are some software solutions that will allow you to essentially perform that snapshotting functionality I mentioned earlier, to actually perform that on a physical system. So Deep Freeze is one software product that some of you may have heard of. It's good and it works, but all these tools have been subverted in the past, and while I think right now Deep Freeze is safe to use, again, I generally only go to that extent if I need to, because it is just way too easy to run malware within a virtualized environment and jump back to a snapshot when I need to. And the good news is, after this class, you're going to understand code analysis at a fairly low level, and so as a result, it'll build your confidence when you're working within that VM environment that, you know what, I am fairly confident that this sample is not acting differently because I'm in a VM. You'll be able to look at the code and actually determine that with fairly high confidence. There are some hardware modules, although these are becoming more rare. There are, in fact, some hardware modules you can use to actually also snapshot and revert back to a known good state. One of them that I know was most recently being sold was called PC Guardian, but at this point you really only find these on eBay, and personally I don't see much value in them, considering that you could use VMware, and then if that doesn't work, you could use a physical system to perform your testing. All right, so now we're going to get back to the story that we laid out before, and I'm actually going to demonstrate for you some of the analysis activities that you might actually engage in to better understand srvcp.exe. So we're going to first touch on behavioral analysis. So when we're performing behavioral analysis, this is essentially the flow of our activities. We're first going to activate a series of monitoring tools. Now, it's really personal preference how many tools you want to activate at one time. In my opinion, there's a little risk in activating 2 or 3 tools at a time, because what you'll find is that the tools actually impact each other. There are artifacts that one tool will create in another tool's data set. During today, I'm probably going to run a couple tools at once just to kind of show you what that looks like. What you'll find as you're doing reverse engineering is that you really need to start getting used to what's normal. Those of you who have performed a network analysis or forensic analysis before are familiar with the notion that our job as incident responders is to look for abnormal. But in order to look for the abnormal, you've got to get used to the normal. And so activating multiple monitoring tools just as a kind of a test is helpful to understand the impact that our tools have. And you may even choose to activate monitoring tools when you're not trying to launch any malware at all. It's helpful in understanding your baseline system. So we're going to first activate 1 or more monitoring tools. We're then going to run our malware. This is really my favorite part, right? When you actually get to double-click something, it's it's pretty exciting sometimes. But and I'm not even joking. But that's when we're actually going to run the malware, and we're going to let it run for a little while. Now, what a while means, well, that can vary, right? Sometimes you're dealing with samples that might need to be active for 30 minutes before they'll beacon out, right? Try to reach out to a server. Sometimes it'll take literally a day. You really don't know when you're working on samples in the wild. You need to be open to that. But for our samples, most of them will engage in some sort of activity in 20 to 30 seconds max, and so we'll usually let it run for a short while, and then we're going to go ahead and terminate it. At that point, we'll then pause our monitoring tools. We're going to pause our monitoring tools and assess the impact, try to review all the logs that are produced, and that's really where we're bringing our human intelligence to the table. The tools are great in producing data. We then have to parse through that data in order to understand what's important and really isolate what could turn into valuable indicators of compromise. So that's really the high-level steps that we are going to follow as we go through this process. Now, there are a few tools we'll touch on during this session. One of them is Process Hacker. For those who have used sysinternals tools before, you may have been exposed to Process Explorer. Process Hacker and Process Explorer are very similar. There are some advantages to Process Hacker that you'll see along the way, and so that's what we're going to use in this class. We are, however, going to use the sysinternals Process Monitor, which helps us observe activity at a very low level. We're also going to take a look at TCP log view, which can be used for networking, and Wireshark, which many of you may have heard of or used often before, which helps us actually capture network traffic. So I'm going to go to my VM system here. And again, you're welcome to follow along in your own system, so hopefully you can see my Learn REM environment now. This is on my Windows side. But I encourage you to kind of soak it in a little bit for now. And again, we're gonna end a little earlier today since this is intro content, and I'll be around to answer questions as you perhaps launch your own environment. So this is what the Windows 8.1 environment looks like on my desktop. You'll see a variety of folders as well as shortcuts to tools. The ones we have shortcuts for are kind of the ones we use most often, but in each of these directories are some pretty valuable tools that we're going to touch on as we go through the course. So for now, I want to show you a process hacker. This is one of my favorite tools, not necessarily for collecting content, but for really observing the state of my system. Now you'll notice on the left-hand side we have a tree-like view that shows me all the processes that are running. I can kind of click on some of these arrows to expand them out. You'll see, for example, we have a bunch of SVC hosts running, which is pretty normal. You also see that a parent to that SVC host is services.exe. So doing this kind of exploration is incredibly valuable because as you perform our analysis, for example, maybe you'll see an SVC host process that launches when you launch your suspect file. However, if that SVC host process does not have services, right up here, it does not have services as its parent, then that could be an indication that you're dealing with a malicious code. So it's helpful in understanding the parent-child processes. As you look at all these columns, there is quite a bit here. You can see the username under which a process is running. So if, for example, again, if I see SVC host running as a user instead of network service or local service or system, that again is highly suspicious. You'll then see a description of that particular process, and if I right-click here and choose columns, you'll see that there are many, many more columns that you can add. So this is an incredibly powerful tool for understanding what's happening on your system. Now keep in mind all this activity is live, so it's not recording any sort of log for you, but it is providing you with information on current activities so that when you launch a new process, for example, you'll see that here. There are many tabs here, as you might notice towards the top. So I'm on processes right now. If I go to services, these are the list of installed services and the state of those services. As you may be aware, one of the goals of malware is often to maintain persistence on a system so that if the user logs off or the system is rebooted, the malware continues to run. Well, one way it does that is by installing a service. And so having the services tab, take a quick look at, is also helpful. I have a network tab here, which we'll talk about shortly. But hopefully that's a quick glimpse as to why this tool is so powerful and why it's pretty critical to have in your tool set. One more thing I will show you, though, is that let's say, for example, that we want to analyze Process Hacker, right, the current tool that we're looking at. If I double-click on it, there's a wealth of information about this particular process that you can dive into. So going to the General tab, for one, I have the image file name and the command line. This gives me insight into the full path of the process. Now, why is that helpful? Well, again, let's say I'm looking at an SVC host process that's running, and I'm trying to determine if it's legitimate. I could look, for example, at the full command line to understand what the path is. If it's executing out of ctemp, well, that's a pretty serious red flag that you could be dealing with something suspicious. But if it's operating out of system32, maybe that's evidence to indicate that it's a likely legitimate file. As I go through these tabs, you'll see some other ones that are helpful. Modules, for example. These are all of the DLLs, or shared libraries, that are currently being used by this process. So when you're dealing with DLL injection, for example, well, you might see an anomalous DLL in here. Now, there are more efficient ways to parse this data, and we're going to talk about it. But this is helpful as one way to look at imported modules. If I go to memory, I can see the state of memory for this particular process. What you're looking at here are basically different memory segments. And even these will be helpful to us as we perform reverse engineering later on during these sessions. I will, however, point you to one button up here, strings. So not only can you run strings against a file on disk, but you can run strings against a process in memory. And so by going with the defaults here, it's going to show me any strings that are 10 characters or more. And oftentimes, this can be very helpful when you're performing malware analysis, particularly when you're dealing with obfuscated executables. So perhaps on disk, the file is heavily encrypted or encoded, but that file in memory, well, typically you'll see a lot more, because even if it's encrypted or coded on disk, in order to accomplish its goals, the malware is going to have to deobfuscate itself in memory. So looking at these strings in memory can also be incredibly helpful. And you also have other tabs here, like the handles one. A handle is a reference to an object on the file system, such as a registry key, It could be to a mutex. Mutexes are often used to ensure that multiple instances of malware aren't running at once. It could be a handle to another file. These are other ways to track what a process is actually trying to access and what it's using as it accomplishes its activities. All right, so that's just kind of an excerpt from Process Hacker, pretty powerful. I usually have it on the right-hand side here whenever I am launching malicious code because, well, for starters, I want to make sure the code actually launched. If I launch a sample and I don't see it on the right here, that could be an indication that it's either detecting my VM environment, that the code just crashed for some reason, maybe it just doesn't work. It's possible. Sometimes attackers make programming errors and just deploy a dud. And so in either case, it's helpful for me to make sure that the process is running so that I know that I'm analyzing a currently infected system. All right, now I'm going to turn over to Process Monitor. Now I'm going to close this box, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. You'll notice here that Process Monitor is generating a lot of data, and I'm going to go ahead and pause it here and see if my magnification is working. Yep, it is. There we go. So what you should see here is over 51,000 events. Over 51,000 events have already been generated on this particular machine, and well, that's quite a few for the few seconds that I had this running. Process Monitor is incredibly robust and good at logging all sorts of data across the system. Every read, every write, everything that's happening is being logged, and that's great. The problem, however, is that it's producing, well, a lot of data. I can't go through 51,000 events in a reasonable period of time. And so we're typically going to use this very strategically and in combination with a filter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go ahead and clear this. I can clear it using this button right here. All right, so now I've gone ahead and cleared that. And I'm going to do a quick test by launching my malware specimen. Now, I mentioned I want to look at srvcp.exe. That is located under my malware folder right here on the desktop under day 1, and it's called srvcp. Now, this is basically how you're going to unzip files when you start working on them yourself, which is something we'll do later on this week in our next session. You're going to right-click on the zip file, you're going to go to 7-zip, and then you're going to go to, oh, you're not going to do that. Don't do what I just did. What you're going to do, let's backtrack here. Got a little click happy. I'm going to go to day 1. You're going to right-click on srvcp. You're going to go to 7-zip, extract here, and you're going to type in malware. Now, for our samples, malware will always be the password. And the goal here is not confidentiality, right? We're not trying to hide anything from you. We're just trying to prevent you from double-clicking on this when you don't mean to. And so it's kind of a helpful way to package these solutions so that, well, they're safe, and also so that AV doesn't pick them up. So if you drag one of these to a thumb drive, maybe you're putting it somewhere else, it's unlikely that AV will pick this up because it is zipped. All right, so I'm going to open up my Process Monitor again here since closed that by mistake. I'm going to go ahead and allow it to start creating its log file. I'm going to clear this and stop my activity. Oh, my apologies, kept pressing the wrong button. All right, so now I'm going to state where I'm actually going to launch my sample. So I got Process Hacker here on the right-hand side. I have Process Monitor ready to go. And I have my srvcp that I'm going to launch. Now, a lot of the game here is kind of reconfiguring your Windows properly. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. But the goal here is to try and have Process Hacker visibility and also view of Process Monitor. All right, now another point I want to make here. When you launch a sample, you always want to launch it with admin rights. We were trying to launch samples with admin rights because we want it to be as bad as it can be. And some of these samples require higher level privileges. Now, as part of my robust testing, I absolutely always also run it with user rights, but that's later. Right? When I approach malware analysis, I always assume I got 10 minutes to analyze a sample, right? I start off with a very aggressive timeline because I never know when the manager is going to pop in and be like, hey, what's the sample about? And so I try to be strategic with my approach. I try to very quickly analyze high impact artifacts, and then I'll kind of dig deeper as necessary. So to start off with, I'm always going to run as administrator. So in order to run this tool, I'm now going to launch my capture so I can start capturing. I'm going to overwrite this file here. I'm going to right-click and go to Run as Administrator. And look on the right-hand side. You should see srvcp pop up, right? It was temporarily green. indicating a new process, and now it's continuing as expected. Now, I've let the sample run for, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 seconds now, and I think that's okay for my purposes. So I'm now going to go up here again to this magnifying glass, and I'm going to stop this capture. So I've stopped the capture. I'm going to also terminate the sample. And I'm now going to review my data. Now, this is quite a bit of data, like I mentioned before. So now we're looking at over 63,000 events as you look on the bottom of the screen. Let's talk a little bit about what this is showing me. So I have a process name, okay, like explorer.exe. I have an operation. That's essentially like a Windows API call. You're going to become very familiar with Windows API calls. Anything interesting happens with Windows API calls, which is why we're going to talk over and over about them, not only from a behavioral perspective, but from a code level perspective. So is Windows API call, for example, this one's used, well, to create a file, at least that's what it's called. The path is usually the argument to that API call, or the actual whatever it's intending to actually take a look at in the case of reading a file. You also have the result here. The result represents whether or not that operation was a success or a failure. And then as I scroll over here, you have detail. And shortly you'll see why looking at the detail can be so helpful. As I scroll down, you'll see lots of different events, lots of different process names. Now we need to be able to digest this somehow that makes sense. And so I'm going to turn your attention to this funnel on the top of the screen. It's a filter button. This allows me to essentially filter this data, and that's pretty powerful because we want to start systematically going through this data in order to determine what some of its key impacts are. Now, when I'm looking at malware, I am concerned about a couple operations. For example, I want to know if it's creating files. Why? Because I want to then assess the purpose of the files that it might have created, and maybe those could be used as valuable IOCs. So in order to do that, I can go to this first pull down here, and I can actually pick what I want it to filter. So in this particular case, I'm trying to filter operations. So I'm going to pick an operation. I'm going to say my operation is, and when I click on this third pull down, I have a variety of options to choose from. Now I'm concerned about create file right now, so I can choose that. So now it's going to filter on only create files. That's the only operation it's going to show me. And then I click add. Now more than that, I know that I clicked on srvcp.exe, and looking at process hacker, right down here, I had seen that the process was called srvcp.exe, as you might expect. And so I'm also going to filter by process name. Process name is srvcp.exe, and I'm going to add. Now you'll also notice there are a bunch of filters already configured. Now a lot of these, this is essentially configured by the authors, essentially removing Procmon related information, right? So they've determined that, okay, these are the activities that the tool produces, and so we're going to remove that. Now that's incredibly helpful. Not every tool does that. This one does. Right now we are filtering now by create file and srvcp.exe. So I'm now going to hit apply. I'm going to press OK. And as you look at the bottom, you'll notice I'm only looking at 70 events. Wow, that is far, far less than 63,000. All right, the world is starting to seem a little bit more normal, and I am certainly a lot less stressed out now. So as you go down this list, you want to look for, well, any interesting activity. So I'm going down here, and this is how I would, as an analyst, think about this problem. I'm going down here, and I'm seeing various DLLs, a couple EXEs, okay, and of course create file is the operation being worked on. Also seeing some name not found. Now when it says name not found, that typically means it was not able to find a file. So I'm starting at the top, looking around. You might wonder, hey, kernel32.dll, that's kind of weird that it's creating that file, because that's actually a very well-known, legitimate system file. Well, that's a very good point, but this is where the detail column comes in. You'll notice here it says read control. Over here it says generic read. So Microsoft has been kind enough to use an API called create file to not only create a file, but also to read a file. And so that's a nuance that you need to keep in mind. Now, how would you know this? Well, you could have looked at the detail column here, but I also highly suggest that you always have an internet-connected machine near you when you're performing reverse engineering, And what I would do next when I saw an API call like this is just to Google create file. You can combine it with MSDN, that term, and you'll be taken to Microsoft's page where they will define very nicely for you the inputs and outputs of create file, and most importantly, its purpose. And so at that point, you might be able to understand that not only can it create files, but it can read files too. Let's scroll down. I'm seeing some additional interesting activity. Specifically, I see a reference to gus.ini. And again, this is create file, and it's trying to do a generic read here, right? So it's not actually trying to create it. I am not familiar with this file. I don't know about you all, but I've never heard of gus.ini before. That does not seem like a system file like some of these other ones. So that is a little strange, and that's something I would probably want to document, maybe in my Notepad doc, wherever I'm placing observations, because that's a little strange, and we'll come back to that. All right, so create file is one operation that malware often engages in, and so that's why I kind of keyed in on that first. Let's take a look at some other filters. For example, from a persistent perspective, I mentioned services earlier. Well, malware often likes to modify the registry for persistence. That's one way to ensure that its sample is executed after a user reboots or when they log off and log on. So I'm now going to look for some other activity. I'm going to look for an operation that involves the registry. And as I scroll down to the R's here, you'll see there are a few. I'm most interested in reg set value, which should be somewhere here. There it is, set value. The reason is because, well, this is the API call used to actually change the registry. If malware is changing the registry, I want to know about it. You'll find lots of malware that reads different parts of the registry, and that's fine. Maybe it's doing some fingerprinting. Maybe I'll dive into that if I have time. But if it's changing the registry, I want to know about it. It's not always bad, but it's definitely suspicious. And so I am going to add this to my filter here. Now, I no longer want to look at create files, so you got to be very careful to start removing some of this stuff. So I now have srvcp.exe and reg set value. I'm going to apply this. I'm going to hit OK, and wow, one event of over 63,000. This is amazing, right? This is a good day. Far less data for me to review, but it's a very important data point. Check it out. It appears to be setting the current version run service profiler key. The run key is often used by malware for persistence. And so if the run key is being modified, that is absolutely an important observation, because this malware is now trying to configure itself to run when a user logs in or after a reboot. All right, so this would be another observation that I make. Now, the time right now is 8:05, and what I'd like to do is essentially provide a quick break every hour or so. We still certainly have some more content to go through today, but I do want to provide you the opportunity just to run to the bathroom or just kind of look somewhere else than your bright screen. So I'm now going to break for about 5 minutes. All right, so I will be back during that time. I encourage you to go ahead and just take a break for 5 minutes, and then we will get started again. The current time I have is 7:05, and we will start again at 7:10. If you have any other issues, by the way, at this time, feel free to either privately message me or message to everyone in the chat. Thank you. All right, everybody. Let me check and see if people are back. So we got a couple, 3 or 4 people who haven't yet returned. We'll get another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome back, everyone. So, seen a couple what appear to be private messages here. People are trying to work on the appliance and having perhaps some issues. So what I suggest is that I'm happy to provide some support and see if I can help you troubleshoot some of the issues. But let's do that after the content is complete. It's probably another 45 to an hour of content, perhaps, and then I can help you personally troubleshoot some of the issues that you might be facing. All right, so we are going to get started again here. I'm going to move back to my my virtual environment here. So when we left off, now we are performing behavioral analysis, just in case you forgot during those 5 minutes, we were performing behavioral analysis against srvcp.exe, right? So we had an admin who discovered this weird process on his machine, didn't really know what it was doing, saw some odd network connections. They managed to pull off this file and provide it to us. And we were trying to add some value to their investigation by trying to determine what it is that srvcp does, what it's there for, what it's capable of, and ask some of those key questions. So I had collected thousands of events in Process Monitor, and now I'm trying to parse through those events effectively. And one way to do that is to use this filter button. By using the filter button, I'm now specifying certain operations that I am interested in when it comes to assessing this malware. Now, I want to caution you about the filter button. It's perfectly fine to, from a strategic perspective, prioritize certain operations to begin with. But you absolutely, time permitting, you absolutely need to look at other processes as well as other operations, because there's always the chance that you're going to miss something. So for example, just filtering by the process name srvcp.exe is fine to start off with, but if, for example, it's injecting into other processes, well, you would miss a lot of activity if you only looked at srvcp.exe. And so while it's perfectly fine to do that, if you got a short period of time, I encourage you to also go on an exploration through the other parts of the data, because you could be missing some important activity and important indicators of compromise. All right, so that's all I really wanted to show you for now when it comes to Process Monitor. I'm going to go ahead and close this. So we've talked a little bit about how you can assess the impact on the machine, right? I looked at Process Hacker, I saw the process run, and I also took a look at Process Monitor to better understand what's happening. Let's start moving towards the network now, right? So we're kind of moving away from the file system, and now we want to start talking about network, because when malware is trying to achieve some sort of goals, whether it's gather data or destroy information, typically there's going to be some communication to the outside world. It could be as simple as, hey, just telling the C2 server, the command and control server, you know what, I'm alive, I successfully landed on target. And it certainly could be more complex than that. Maybe it's providing a reverse shell back to an attacker that the adversary is going to use to literally walk through your file system and pick and choose what they want. And so looking for that C2, that command and control, is an integral part of our analysis process. And there's a few ways we can do that. I'm going to introduce a couple tools. I'm going to first go into my network monitoring folder here, and you'll find a shortcut here to TCP log view. That's one of the tools that you can use for network analysis. Now the key thing about this tool, and it's essentially implied with its name, is that it is a log. It is TCP log view, and so it's not providing you necessarily with live activity. It's giving you a log of activity. And so let's say, for example, that I now launch srvcp.exe again. I'm going to run it as admin. You'll notice that we see a connection. Now, TCP log view is generally only going to show you essentially established TCP connections. But in this case, well, we actually see a listening port here, which could be interesting, because if we're looking for back doors, this would be one way to notice it. So TCP log view is helpful, not necessarily in providing log activity, but you actually have a log of what's happening at a network level. Now I want to show you one more thing here, and this is with Process Hacker, and you'll kind of see how TCP log view and Process Hacker both work together. If I go to the Network tab here, you might start to see some interesting activity, right? It's like it's Christmas again. You see some green and some red. So greens typically mean new processes, and red means exiting processes. Now, on the owner side here, you also might notice when these pop up that it says DNS cache. Here's the deal. Here's what's happening. When a malware specimen makes a DNS request, right, when they're looking for their domain name, perhaps for C2, that request actually gets filtered through svchost.exe. And so what we're looking at here is most likely beaconing traffic. It's most likely beaconing traffic. And so that's something to keep a lookout for when you execute code and you're on the target machine here. Now again, Process Hacker is providing you that live view. It's showing me these attempts both starting up and shutting down essentially because they're not successful, while TCP log view is giving me this log of, hey, by the way, there's a listening port that's been established. You'll notice it's not showing me this SVC host activity because that's not an established TCP connection. All right, so that's an important difference I wanted to note between these two tools. Now I'm going to go back and terminate this process, right? So I'm going to be doing this a lot. There's a lot of iterative testing when you're performing malware analysis, and this is just one example of how that works. You start tools, you start the malware, then you stop the malware, then you close down the tools. You're going to be doing that quite a bit. It's a pretty strategic, systematic way to test these samples. So in the spirit of better analyzing network activity, you may have expected I'm going to talk about Wireshark next, and I'm actually going to launch that on REMnux. All right, so whenever possible, it is helpful to have a third-party system observing activity. Why? Well, it's always possible that my malware, when I run it on the Windows system, will actually interfere with my tools. I kind of brought up that case earlier today. And so running tools like Wireshark, which can easily be run on another machine because they're observing network traffic, well, that's a pretty good deal because I'm just minimizing the possibility that the malware will actually interfere with my tools. Now, in a lot of cases, you can't do that. So, I mean, Process Monitor, the cons, the risks of it being messed around with when code is running, I think they're fairly low, and so the benefits outweigh the costs. But when it comes to Wireshark, it's way too easy just to set up a listener on another machine, and that's really why we have REMnux provided to you, so that it can also provide this third-party perspective for behavioral analysis. So you can launch Wireshark on REMnux by literally typing Wireshark, pretty easy command, and it's going to go ahead and launch this. Now for you to actually observe activity, and you'll see more of this as you go through the workbook setting up your VMs, you need to make sure that your default gateway on your Windows machine is pointing to REMnux, right? And that they can actually communicate across the network. That's pretty key here. If you're having issues doing that, again, I'm happy to help you once the lecture portion of today is complete. So I'm now going to hit Start. Start is now going to start logging network activity, full packet capture. I'm going to go back now to SRVCP, and I'm going to launch it again. But this time, I'm less concerned about what's happening on the victim host, and I want to view the network. As always, I'm going to run as administrator. All right, so I've now launched it. I've confirmed I've launched it because I see it in Process Hacker. Very important step. I now go to REMnux. As I scroll down, you'll start seeing DNS queries. Most importantly, you should see a DNS query for irc.mcs.net. Now, that's probably kind of a dead giveaway, right? It does, in fact, appear to be communicating with IRC servers. Certainly, malware will not always present such an easy-to-understand domain name, but the important part of the process to take away here is that using Wireshark on REMnux, I'm now launching malware on my Windows machines, and I'm able to get visibility into network artifacts. Now, my goal when I perform behavioral analysis is to facilitate activity, not just observe activity. I'm not just here to sit back and watch. I'm here to facilitate activity. And what that means is that if I see malware asking for something, I want to provide an answer. Now, I want to provide an answer that's convenient for me, but I want to provide an answer. Because you know what? If malware, in this case, for example, if it is unable to contact irc.mcs.net, it's probably not going to do anything interesting. It's probably trying to connect to that host for a reason, and that reason is what I'm interested in, because at the end of the day, I'm trying to determine why is this thing on my network? Why has this code shown up on my target machine? What is it capable of? What's its purpose? And who put it here? And in order to answer any of that, I need to see it do something. Well, at least that's the easiest way to get visibility into a specimen's purpose. So we have a variety of tools that are built into REMnux that will help you do that. In this particular case, it is submitting a DNS query, and it is not getting a DNS response. Why? Well, we don't have a domain name service server running on this machine, right? We don't have a DNS server, but we can essentially launch a lightweight one that's included in REMnux. It's called fake DNS, and its goal is to essentially fake out DNS. What you're going to realize is we have a bunch of tools on here that allow you to mimic services, mimic common services like web servers, like even HTTPS servers, like SMTP servers, and DNS servers. Now, these aren't full-blown servers. They're not as configurable as an actual DNS server, for example, might be, but they're good enough to provide basic responses that specimens are looking for in order to encourage and facilitate activity. That's the real goal here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is this, just to make this a clean test, I'm going to go ahead and terminate my process again. I'm going to go here and I'm going to restart my capture. Right, I want to start with a clean slate. That still caught some of that residual activity. I'm going to go ahead and do this again. All right, and what you'll notice, and this is actually pretty helpful, right, is that, well, there is network activity even when I'm not running malware. I'm going to emphasize again and again, it's extremely important to understand the baseline lab in which you are operating. So this is my lab. I got Windows 8.1. I got REMnux. I need to understand the network activity associated with just normal behavior so that when I see malware operating, I don't attribute the wrong activity to malware. So for example, I see some queries for Microsoft domains. Well, that's probably because I have a Microsoft operating system on my other VM, and it's going to occasionally perform queries to check for patches or to check for other information. Microsoft products inherently are very chatty, right? They're purpose-built to connect to networks, and so when they think they might even possibly be on a network, they're going to start talking, and they're going to say things that aren't relevant to reverse engineering. In order to effectively sift that stuff out, over time, you kind of just get used to what's normal. And that's a very important evaluation to perform. So in this particular case, I see some traffic here. Okay, that's fine, right? I know I haven't launched my malware yet, and so I wouldn't expect to see anything. What I am going to do, however, is also launch a fake DNS, because my goal here, again, is to fake out the malware so it believes that it actually has contacted the server it intends to, in this case, irc.mcs.net. So fake DNS is going to see that DNS query, and it's going to say, oh, you know what? That domain you're looking for, that's me, right? That is REMnux. And it's going to provide it with the IP address of REMnux. And from that point forward, my victim machine, which is my Windows 8.1 VM, is going to consider REMnux to be the C2 server that it was trying to reach out to. All right, so I'm now going to launch fake DNS. You do that simply by typing in fake DNS at the terminal here. I'm going to go back to my Windows machine, right-click on srvcp.exe, and hit Run as admin. As always, I confirm it is actually running, as I see here on the right-hand side. I then go to REMnux, and you'll notice, wow, fake DNS has already provided a bit of a log. It says irc.mcs.net was queried for, and it provided this IP. This is the IP address of my REMnux machine. And so this is working as expected. So now I can go to my network traffic. I'm going to scroll down here to get to some interesting activity. And now things look different, but there are still challenges ahead. Namely, when I look at this traffic, well, okay, I'm not seeing DNS queries anymore. Those are effectively handled. But I am seeing these resets being sent back to my victim machine. In order to understand these, I got to look at the traffic coming from my victim machine. And what it appears to be doing is looking at a specific port, 6667. Now, this correlates with my admin's observations. My admin also noted that there was some suspicious traffic to port 6667. And so, again, my task is to facilitate activity. And so in this particular case, I might realize this is associated with IRC. And so my next task is to actually launch an IRC server. So I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to open up a new prompt here. And built into REMnux is a fairly simple IRC server called Inspire CD. So I'm going to launch it by doing IRCD start. It's then going to launch Inspire CD. And if I observe this traffic, I should at some point see it to start making more sense. And there we go. So I'm no longer seeing reset packets sent. This actually looks like real data. Now in Wireshark, in order to investigate this further, rather than trying to piece together individual packets, good luck doing that in any sort of reasonable time, I'm going to right-click and hit Follow TCP Stream. And you'll notice that there is some observable content here. Now, I'm going to apologize up front for anyone who might be offended. Obviously, this includes some terminology that isn't exactly appropriate. The reason, however, that we are including this information is because, well, we're trying to expose you to some real malware. And when you look at real malware, the fact is a lot of times you see profanity. Okay? And so this is just one example of that. But getting back to the investigation, what I'm trying to discover is how this thing communicates. I've now confirmed it's probably using IRC. And specifically, I can see the NIC that it's using, the user name here, and the channel that it's joining. Now you'll notice this is a different channel, right? This is a different channel from what my admin saw. Admin saw, I think it was like Mikey Soup or something. And so that's a little odd, but that's okay. I'm still seeing activity, which means I've been successful in facilitating activity. All right, so I'm going to go ahead now and terminate SRVCP because that was the extent of the test I wanted to run for now. I'm going to go ahead and close this. And of course, typically you'd want to save this information off. I'm not too interested in doing so right now simply because I'm performing a demo. But on the job, you would absolutely want to actually save all this data off so that you could take another look at it at your leisure. All right, so now I'm going to hop back to the slides now to emphasize some of the key points that we've been talking about. So during this journey of performing behavioral analysis, we started off by looking at Process Hacker. We've gone over a number of key advantages that Process Hacker provides. In this particular case, I showed you how it's critical to determining that your malware is in fact running. I did see a comment here that they did not see any mention of FakeNet in the book. So FakeNet we actually are going to mention later on in class as another tool at your disposal. FakeNet is also a fake DNS type tool, and you typically run FakeNet on your victim machine. But we are going to talk about it. What you'll probably see as we go through this material is that when we talk about observing any particular type of data, there are a variety of tools that you can use. And I heavily encourage you to use a variety of tools. Many of these you'll find are free. And that's of great benefit to us because that means very little cost. Right? We just have to download it and install it. The downside, however, is that they're not necessarily fully supported. Right? In many cases, there's one person, literally one person sometimes supporting a tool in the community, which means well, life gets busy. Maybe at some point they'll no longer be able to update it. Maybe bugs will be discovered that will not be fixed. And so it's very helpful to have multiple tools in your box that you can use to kind of corroborate one another. And so FakeNet, which we do touch on later on in the class, can absolutely also be used for fake DNS type activities. So thank you for that question, Derek. All right, moving on here. So we looked at Process Hacker, and I kind of showed you up front some of the interesting tabs that you can take a look at when it comes to a particular process, such as strings and handles and modules. I then turned to Process Monitor. Process Monitor was an incredibly powerful tool. The downside, however, was that it produces a ton of data. So in order to actually parse through that data, we created filters. One filter we created was specifically not only looking for srvcp.exe, but also more specifically looking for a certain operation, such as create file. Create file, as we learned, can be used not only to literally create files, but also to read files. When we looked at the output, we saw a number of legitimate Windows files that appeared to be being read, which is perfectly normal. But we also noticed this file gus.ini. Now that was not something we recognized, and the result was that the name was not found, so the file was not found. That's something interesting and something we'll come back to shortly. After looking create file, we then looked at reg set value. I mentioned to you that malware often attempts to maintain persistence. They've worked so hard, the attackers worked so hard to get on your system, they want to maintain that access. And so as part of that, they may do something like modify the registry to configure persistence. One popular way to do that specifically is to modify the run key, and that's what the sample did in this case. I emphasize the importance of running malware as an administrator so that it can be as bad as it can be, right? It wants to have more, with more rights, it can certainly engage in more activity. And while at some point I do want to tie that back to the impact on my enterprise, so maybe my users are not running with admin rights, I do want to understand the highest impact scenario. I want to know what that highest impact scenario is. And so the way to find that out very quickly is to run the tool as administrator, right? You always want to run your samples as admin to begin with. The slide number 34, basically talks about the filter, which we've mentioned a few times now, so I'm going to move on. I do want to mention, however, that you can actually save these filters. So let's say within your enterprise environment, and you've gone ahead and created a VM that represents your enterprise environment, there are a number of applications that are known goods, right? You have no issue with them. You know 100% for certain that they are non-malicious, and activity associated with them is non-malicious. And so as a result, you might create a filter and just kind of save that off so that every time you run malware in that particular VM, you don't have to worry about viewing that particular activity. Now, for those who prefer Excel, and let's be honest, Excel is an extremely powerful application, you could also export Process Monitor to a CSV file, and then from that point forward, import it into Excel, and then use its filtering functionality to peruse that data. Right? That totally makes sense, and that's something that people often do. So that's an option I wanted to make sure that you were aware of. After looking at impacts on the file system, we then started moving towards network activity to understand, hey, what's the network impact of srvcp.exe? When you're dealing with malware, the biggest question is, does this thing engage in C2, command and control? Is something or someone out there actively controlling the specimen that landed on my machine? Because when it's being actively controlled, well, the attacker can do lots of things, and you want to try to figure out what that is. And so the first step towards doing that is just analyzing network activity and network artifacts. We talked about a couple tools to do that. TCP log view is one that shows a log of TCP connections. I also showed you how in Process Hacker you could see that sort of DNS query activity. You would have also been able to see that listening port that you saw in TCP log view, so definitely some overlap between those two tools. But Wireshark is probably the bread and butter of network analysis. I'm always launching Wireshark in the background on REMnux, absolutely, because if I want to slice and dice some network traffic, Wireshark is the tool to use to do it. And when we launched Wireshark in this case, we saw srvcp.exe making a DNS query. The response, however, was that the destination was unreachable, the port. That's because, well, these queries are going to port 53, which is what DNS typically runs on, and we do not have a DNS server up and running at this point. The next step then was to continue to try and facilitate activity by faking the sample out, right? And one program that we can use to do that is fake DNS. Fake DNS essentially helps us respond to every DNS query with a DNS response that in this case specifies the REMnux VM as the server. And so from that point forward, the sample would think irc.mcs.net. Well, that domain is actually located at our REMnux machine. All right, so this is an incredibly powerful tool, right? Very, very, very simple concept, incredibly powerful for redirecting malicious traffic. And that was our goal in this case. After initiating fake DNS, we saw some additional traffic, some new traffic, which is progress, right? This is all about just making incremental progress. And this was absolutely a case of that. We saw some incremental progress here, and namely that we saw attempts to actually establish a TCP connection. But most of the responses were resets. And the reason that we talked about was because my victim host was reaching out to port 6667. And on port 6667 on my REMnux machine, there was nothing there. There's nothing there to receive that traffic. And so that's why these reset packets are being sent in response. So as we move forward towards our goal of facilitating and encouraging activity, we then decided to launch IRCD start. That allowed us to launch an IRC server. When we did that, we saw additional activity. The TCP connection was in fact established, and we could actually take a closer look at specifically the content that was being sent. We could do that using follow TCP stream. All right, follow TCP stream allowed us to take a much closer look at what was actually happening on the system. All right, now we did notice at that point that the channel and the nickname were slightly different than what we saw before. Right, prior to this point, we saw a channel Micah G. That's
muted.
Control, possibly using IRC, and so we have learned quite a bit. We could even play around with the C2 server. We could, for example, log in ourselves to the IRC server and then try to send messages. Right? We could try to actually interact with the bot. Right? You've probably heard of takedown operations when it comes to bot activities. Partly how you do that is by taking control of the C2 server. In this case, we're acting as the C2 server on REMnux, and so it's possible for us to log into the IRC server and actually try to use the /message command to actually send messages to the bot. Now, I do want to mention IRC is certainly less used these days. HTTP is probably more popular, and we're going to get into how that activity occurs. But this is a good example for showing initial C2 communications. But let's get back to our investigation. All right, so we have understood srvcp.exe a bit more. We could stop now, but you know what? I don't feel comfortable doing so. And the reason is because I saw it asking for this file, gus.ini. And my experience tells me that when malware is often looking for a file like that, whether it's called ini or not, when it's looking for a specific file, it's very possible that there will be within that file some information that it uses to act a certain way. And specifically, I noticed that when I ran behavioral analysis against a sample, I saw something different than my admin. And so I want to investigate this more. Now, what we're going to assume now is that, and I brought up this case earlier on, is that we're working as part of investigation. I go to my admin now. I say, hey, listen, I saw my sample reaching for gus.ini. Have you seen that sample anywhere, perhaps on that system that you first found to be potentially compromised? And in this case, the admin says, yes, I did see gus.ini there. Perhaps they go and retrieve it for us, or maybe we have a group of forensics analysts working on this problem, and they're able to forensically acquire that file as well. So I have this file for us here. And of course, the assumption is we got it from somewhere else, but gus.ini is right here. And what I want to do now is I actually want to perform a test. I want to understand, hey, does this actually impact behavior in some way? But let's take a quick look at gus.ini. All right, we're able to obtain this file. It's helpful to look at it. I'll scroll down here so you can see the end. Now, this is interesting. For starters, when I see files that have data I don't understand, I ask myself a simple question. Is this encrypted or is this encoded? Now, I may not know for absolutely sure, but to me this looks like encoded content, not encrypted. Why? Because if a file is encrypted, for starters, it's not organized so well, right? This appears to be very structured, right? There are clear ends to the line here, pretty organized, which is not characteristic of encrypted content. Also, all of these appear to be readable characters, meaning they're all either letters or numbers or symbols. When you have encrypted content, a lot of that doesn't fall into the ASCII space, and so they're typically, you'll see a lot of weird characters here that simply can't be represented in a text editor. And so I believe that these are probably, this is probably an encoded file. That's just a theory right now. We'll touch more on that later. Now, our admin specified to us that they found this file in system 32, right? That's where it was located. And so if that's the case, that's going to be where I want to put this file to. So I'm going to go ahead, go to system 32. And I'm going to copy and paste gus.ini there. I'm also going to place srvcp there, right? The admin noticed that both these files were located there, so I'm actually going to copy and paste that there too for now. But I'm going to leave one version on my desktop in case I want to use it. All right. Now before I run this next test, I'm going to go back to REMnux. I'm going to kind of clean up a little bit here, right? I already want to make sure that captures stopped. I'm going to start this again. I've already systematically gone through this process of starting up the servers, so those continue to be running just fine. I'm going to leave those, and finally, again, I'm capturing. All right, so I got my REMnux state set up. Before you actually double-click on anything, it's always good to kind of make sure that your house is in order, you got the tools up and running that you want, and capturing if need be. All right, so now I got my gus.ini file in there. I'm now going to right-click, and I'm going to run as administrator again. You'll see here, my tool, in fact, does appear to be running. I'm going to go now to REMnux. I see the activity I suspected. IRC again is running. Fake DNS did in fact see that request one more time. And I'm going to go to follow TCP stream. Now I'm seeing some more expected behavior. Namely, I'm seeing that it's joining this MicroG soup channel, which is precisely what I saw earlier, right? So we're getting closer and closer to what my admin observed, which means we're making progress. Our goal here is to make progress, and the closer we can get to the observed activity on target, the more likely it is that this malware actually thinks it's on target. And when it's in a position where it thinks it's on target, that means we have good opportunity to analyze this code and actually determine, even at a code analysis level, what it's doing. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this capture now, and I'm going to go back to my REM workstation. I have completed this test. I'm going to hit terminate here, right-click and terminate. And now my system is in expected state. I'm going to go back to the slides. All right, so like I said, we placed these files in System32 because the admin indicated to us that's where these did reside. We then performed our test again, and we noticed that it actually joined this MicroG soup channel, right? And so now our observations fall more in line with what our admin saw, and that was the goal here, right? So we now match the behavior observed in the wild. All right, so hopefully it's clear that behavioral analysis, well, it's quite valuable. We've learned a lot about the registry keys that are being set, the files that are being looked after, the network artifacts that are created, the command and control protocol that is being used, and even how we might begin interacting with these samples if we wanted to engage in some sort of a takedown process. Certainly IOCs are a popular output for this type of analysis, indicators of compromise that you can use to rapidly detect similar activity on your network or on other networks, perhaps information sharing partners. And so we've also produced a lot of that data as well. So behavior analysis can certainly have some big wins, and you might imagine that what I just ran, even though I went step by step just to kind of drive home the key concepts, you could do this type of work fairly quickly, right? In 5 or 10 minutes, you could have ran all these tools, obtained this output, and had some pretty high value information to communicate to your management. All right, so now let's touch on code analysis. All right, so far I've definitely come up with some good observations for my behavioral analysis, but I want to dig deeper. I want to understand what's happening at a low level here. On gus.ini, for example, all right, that's great. It changed the behavior, but when I looked at that file, gus.ini, I have no idea what it is, right? I got no idea what's contained within it, and that makes me feel uncomfortable. I want to have the power to understand what's within gus.ini. That is a question that I want to answer. And so we're not done our investigation just yet. So let's talk a little bit about code analysis. When we do code analysis, there are essentially two capabilities that we're looking for. One is a disassembler, which is going to take that executable content and convert that into assembly. The other is a debugger. A debugger is going to allow me to step through that assembly and execute individual instructions. Now, there are a variety of tools out there to accomplish these goals. We're going to use IDAPRO primarily as our disassembler when we're doing static code analysis. When I say static code analysis, I mean we're looking at the assembly language code without actually running it. And we're going to use OllyDebug for debugging, meaning with OllyDebug, we are going to look at the assembly as well, but we're also going to use Olly to actually run the code and step through instructions. Now there are a variety of other tools that you could use, such as Immunity Debugger, WinDebug. These are all possible and popular disassemblers and debuggers, but we are going to stick with IDAPRO and AliDebug for this class. As you go through the class, you're probably going to start leaning from one to the other, and my hope is that towards the end of the class, you'll probably see the value in both IDAPRO and Ali and when to use which one. All right, so this slide just emphasizes that these powerful tools are going to allow us to look at the code at a very low level. Now, the IDAPRO version we are using here is version 5. It's the free version. There is a commercial version out there. I believe right now it costs around maybe $1,200 to get the commercial IDAPRO license. Now, if you start doing this work on a regular basis, you are going to find that it makes a lot of sense to buy that commercial version, and hopefully your organization would buy it for you. The reason is because, well, IDAPRO has a team of people. They're a company that has a team of people working on IDAPRO. They work on maintaining it and making sure that it's constantly up to date. AliDebug, on the other hand, to my knowledge, is maintained by one person, freely available tool. There is no commercial support, and so when you start doing commercial quality work, meaning you're selling your services or your company is, you're going to want something a little bit more robust. IDAPRO also has some databases built into it, which we'll touch on later, that can save you a lot of time when performing code analysis. But the version we've provided you is the freeware version. It is a major version behind, meaning that version 6 right now is the commercial purchasable version, and version 5 is what you have. It was released, I want to say, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, if not more, and so it is fairly old, but you will find that when you're performing static analysis, it does the job fairly well. It's just that the commercial version will save you some time. All right, so this is an example, right? It's just a slice of the view you would get when you actually throw a sample into IDAPRO. Now, to some of you who may not have seen assembly before, this might look pretty ugly, right? And that's normal. That's perfectly fine. So let's start breaking it down. All right, we're gonna constantly break stuff down into little bits and pieces that we can digest one bit at a time. So on the left-hand side here, on the left-hand side, you see a reference to .text. That simply refers to where we are in the executable. So when you load a file into IDAPRO, it's basically acting like the operating system. And what I mean by that is it's loading that file, that executable content, into memory just as Windows would when you double-click on it. And so the addresses, which will come after the .text, the addresses are actually addresses in memory where this code resides. All right. So the .text refers to the executable content section of this code, and on the right is the address. Now, as we perform more code analysis, you'll see many other sections other than .text, but that's primarily where the executable content is. All right, so we got the section essentially, and we got the address. After that, we have the instructions, the actual x86, right, 32-bit Intel instructions. We got, in this case, pushes and calls. Now, whenever you have instructions, you can have anywhere from 0 to 2, generally, operands or arguments. That's what's on the right-hand side here. So we got instructions, and then the operands to those instructions. When we look at a chunk of code like this, we'll generally want to focus on these calls first. Calls are one of the easier instructions to understand because when you see a call, it basically means it's calling a function, right? So when you see a call, you can think to yourself, all right, this is calling a function. Now, what function is it calling? Well, the function name here is sub_4012c6. Now you might think to yourself, wow, that is a terrible function name. Who would come up with that? Well, the reality is that the developer probably came up with a much better, or at least readable function name. But after it being compiled, that name was removed. And so IDAPRO has no idea what that function is now called. So it's now given it a name. When it doesn't know what a function is, it gives it the name sub_. It follows that with the address, the 32-bit address of where that function is located in memory right now. So after loading this into IDAPRO, if you were to go to address 4012c6, you would actually find that function there, and you could read the assembly associated with that function. All right, but that's the naming convention here. The function that it doesn't recognize is called sub_address of the function. Now, as you look here, you'll see multiple calls, and they all appear to be to the same function. That's interesting, something to keep note of. Now, we also have all these push instructions. When you see a call, it's actually very helpful to look at these push instructions, because the push instructions that are above a call typically represent arguments to the function. So for example, right here, the red, the one that we have boxed in red here, this call has a push above it. Whatever is being pushed here, in this case a string called NHL star PWF, is actually an argument to this function. It's being passed to the function. So we're going to look at calls, then we're going to look at pushes. And we're going to get into the specifics of why, for example, it's called a push at another time. However, I'm just trying to provide you with a couple of rules of thumb you can use to start processing this information. All right, so you look at the calls, you see some functions, then you see pushes, which represent arguments. So what we see here are a bunch of calls to the same function with some pushes that we don't understand. Now, what could be happening here, and this is just a theory, right? I'm going to keep developing theories because that really helps me determine what I'm going to do next when it comes to malware analysis. A theory here is that these strings, which I can't read, are actually going to be deobfuscated or decoded by this function. Now, why do I believe that? Well, it's calling the same function over and over again, and it's providing strings that don't make any sense. Oftentimes in malware, when that's occurring, it means that those strings are actually being decoded by the function. And in this particular case, notice when we looked at that INI file, we couldn't understand much of it, right? And we had also developed the theory initially that that may be encoded as well. And so there's the high possibility here that some sort of encoding is happening with the sample. We don't know much more than that at this point, but that's one way to start processing code blocks like this, right? This is a code block, a block of code, assembly language here, and start coming up with theories as to what it does. And granted, that might be a stretch for some of you at this point. That's totally fine. You're going to get in the habit of creating these kind of theories as you look at this code. Slide number 53 here just kind of emphasizes some of the points I went over. When you look at blocks like this, look at the calls first, then look at the pushes to understand the arguments that are being provided to the calls, right, which are essentially calls to functions. All right, so in this particular case, if you did dive deeper into that sub_ function, you would find that it was actually decoding and deobfuscating those strings. Now, the details are on this slide in terms of the XORs that were happening. They're not necessarily relevant to this example. I wanted to discuss at a high level how you would go about actually taking a look at that code block. Now, you could also take it to the next level. Once you reverse engineer a function, you might even create a script like this Perl one to actually reverse that process. So if you find a custom encoding function, you'll get to the point where you can actually then create a script to reverse that process. All right, now if you did that in this case, right, if you went to that extent and you applied that against the file, you would actually find a bunch of values that might look familiar. All right, that includes gus.ini, Mikey, some of the profanity we saw earlier, irc.mcs. Right, if you provided this, if you executed that script, let me go back here. If you executed this Perl script against the file srvcp.exe, you would have the decoded values on your right, indicating that these were actually encoded somewhere in the file. And that's actually a really powerful test to run. So if you're performing behavioral analysis and you see some interesting observations like the name of a registry key, a file produced, or a domain name that was reached out to, and you don't find that artifact or that string when you look at the static file and you apply a program like strings against it, that very likely means you're dealing with some sort of encoded content. Now, kind of walking you through some more of the code analysis process that we're going to use. Let's say you did then successfully reverse engineer that, you created that Perl script, you're doing great in terms of better understanding what the sample is doing and how it's doing it. Well, you want to somehow remember that work, right? You want to document it, certainly, but IDAPRO, well, the I actually stands for interactive. And the reason is because this is an incredibly powerful tool for actually taking notes along the way of your reverse engineering process. And so in this particular case, if you concluded that that function, that sub_ function deobfuscated a string, you can actually rename it. You can rename it so that every reference to that sub_ function now instead says deobfuscate string. And in upcoming sessions, we're going to do that, right? You're going to reverse engineer a function, you're going to figure out what it does, then you're going to rename that function using IDAPRO, and now anywhere in that code where it references that particular function, you are good to go because you've already put in the work of reverse engineering it, and you don't want to do that over and over again. That's just a glimpse of what's to come. All right, but let's get back to this particular case. So the question I brought up earlier that led me to want to perform more analysis was about gus.ini. I saw gus.ini being checked for. I then did a test and concluded that it does in fact change the behavior, but I still don't know what's contained within that file. I really want to understand what that file has, because clearly the attacker is trying to hide that from me. It was encoded in some way. And so we can actually perform a combination of static code analysis and debugging in order to find that information out. More specifically, we can run SRVCP in the context of a debugger and see if it actually tries to decode that gus.ini file. And if it does, if it is in fact reading that file and decoding it, well, perhaps we can find out precisely what's contained within it. Right? We'll essentially be spying on that process. The goal here is, as infrequently as possible, to actually reverse engineer very difficult functions. Right? Whenever possible, the efficient approach is to let the program do the hard work for you. At some point, the program has to decode that information in gus.ini if it's going to make sense of it. So rather than try and understand complex algorithms, sure, that's fun, right? But it takes a lot of time. And let's be honest, we're always short on time. And so a more efficient approach is to let the program do that for you in memory and then view the results. So we're going to use a debugger to literally single step through instructions, right, so that we can get visibility to what is happening in memory during the execution of this particular code. So what I'm going to do now is, rather than show you a bunch of text on the screen here, I'm actually going to hop back to my environment to demo this for you. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to take advantage of OllyDebug. I'm going to drag srvcp.exe to OllyDebug in order to open it. You'll notice it's taking some time to process. When it's completed, well, we see a lot of information here. So let me go step by step through this. All right, so let's start with the top left. The top left is the disassembler window. This is essentially where we can view the assembly instructions associated with our program. Now, right now, to be clear, I'm going to use my zoom tool here. Looking at the bottom right, we are paused. Our program is paused. It is not currently running, and that's very important to notice, because when we throw our tool, right, our sample, into OllyDebug, we don't want it to just run it, right? We want to have control over the execution. We want to elect to execute the next instruction. So OllyDebug is gracious enough to just pause it for us. Now you might ask, where does it pause it for us? Well, I'm now going to zoom in on the bottom left. It pauses it for us at the entry point. You're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming sessions. The entry point of a program is the address of the first instruction that's going to be executed. All right, it's the address of the first instruction that's going to be executed, meaning that where I am located right now, right, I may not understand all these instructions, but where we are is the first assembly instruction that the CPU would execute after loading this program into memory. That's the typical execution process, all right? So this is our disassembler window. On the right-hand side, you'll notice this window is called registers, and it stores the contents of essentially what are called CPU registers. We're going to become more familiar with registers, but these are essentially small storage locations that are used for fast mathematical operations, as well as the storage of data that will be very, very important to us. All right, so for right now, just consider the stack a storage location for fast operations, and it's directly accessed by the CPU, and we should keep an eye on it, because if important things are being passed around amongst the stack registers, which is what these are called, then they might be important to the execution of the program, right? And that's something that we want to keep in mind. All right, finally, on the left-hand side here, right, just a few more windows to go through. This is called the information window, this one below the CPU window on the left-hand side. Now, you don't always need to keep your eye on this particular window. There obviously are many to keep track of, but occasionally this one will be of value because it might decode a certain command or an argument, right? And when I say decode, I don't necessarily mean encoding, decoding. I mean it'll just be make it more clear to you what is actually being executed up here in the disassembler window. All right, and on the bottom left here we have the dump window. It's called the dump window. This dump window is used to get visibility into specific memory locations. So occasionally, we will want to look at a certain address and just see what's happening in memory there. When that happens, we're going to use the dump window. For now, we're not really going to bother with it. And on the bottom right is another extremely important window. This represents the stack. The stack is a structure in memory that's in some ways used essentially as a scratch pad for a process, right? So you often see a lot of activity here as a process is executed. Now, some of the important things that do show up on the stack are arguments. We talked about arguments, and they were often represented by the push instruction, right? Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier is when you see a push, like let's take this one right here. It says push EBP. EBP is one of these registers. When a push EBP occurs, it's actually pushing the value of the EBP onto the stack. All right, so the stack is like a stack of plates. Last in, first out. So as things are pushed onto the stack, they appear on the top here. And so putting that together with what I talked about with calls, as functions are being called, you can look to the stack, the bottom right here, to better understand the arguments to calls. All right, and this is going to make a lot more sense as you actually start debugging things on your own. All right, now let's focus on the task at hand. We are looking at srvcp.exe, and part of what we're trying to do right now is understand what is contained within gus.ini. Now, in order to understand what is contained within gus.ini, we first need to confirm that it's even reading gus.ini. And we have high suspicions that it does, because when we placed gus.ini in System32, the behavior actually changed. But when you get to the code analysis level, you have the ability, you have the power to start proving some of these theories, and we're going to do that. One very important window to start looking at when you open a program in OllyDbg is called the names window, and you open that up by hitting Control-N. Control-N. So you should now see a window on the screen called the names window. The names window is very powerful because it essentially has a list of function calls that this program makes. Function calls are awesome when it comes to reverse engineering, because if you can look at the function calls that a program makes, you can start to develop really, really solid theories about the activity the program will actually execute. So take a look at some of these, right? For example, I have here send and receive API calls, right? These are essentially API calls in Windows. So perhaps this is capable of sending and receiving network information. And we kind of already know that's the case, right, with behavior analysis. But we can, at a very low level, understanding now how that's occurring. When you look at this name column here, you'll typically see on the left-hand side here a string followed by a dot followed by another string. The string on the left hand typically represents a shared Windows library. So for example, kernel32.dll, that's a shared Windows library. That library contains many functions that other programs used. And the reason Windows includes that in the Windows operating system is so that every developer doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. They can take advantage of pre-existing written functions. And so for example, one of the functions in kernel32 is get system directory. So if you want to get the system directory on a machine, well, you can import, that's what it's called importing kernel32. That means you have a dependency on it, and you can specifically then call get system directory A. All right, so as we peruse this list of functions, we can start to get a better handle on what this program might actually do. But keep in mind, our goal right now is to prove that it's actually accessing gus.ini. And so in order to do that, we want to look for these API calls, these function calls that are actually associated with opening files. So for example, as you peruse this list, we may not be exactly sure what API call would do that, and so it might involve actually looking up some of these calls online in order to determine what they're capable of. I will, however, give you a little hint here, and since we're looking for an access to a file, right, essentially opening a file, I'll draw your attention to fopen. Fopen is used to open files. And so my next task then is to understand how this function is actually being referenced in this program. I can do that by clicking on my right mouse click and going to Find References. This is now showing me all the references in srvcp.exe where fopen is called. In order to dive deeper into one, I can right-click on it and say Follow in Disassembler. Now let me make this window bigger. A lot of window resizing that's going to happen for this kind of work. what you'll see here now is it's brought me to the assembly instruction that is actually going to call fopen. This is pretty awesome because now I know precisely when the program will actually open files, or at least one example. So how can I assess this further? Well, the program's not running right now. That's the problem. And for me to test that this actually opens gus.ini, I kind of need to run the program. But OnlyDebug gives me the opportunity to actually stop execution, right? I can set what's called a breakpoint by right-clicking, going to breakpoint, and going to toggle, or you can use the keyboard shortcut F2. If I do that, you'll see on the left-hand side the address, right? That's the address in memory. The address turns red, and now I can actually run the code up until this point. So I'm going to go to debug and run, and you can hit F9 or go to debug run. You see that on the left-hand side, this has gone from red to black. On the bottom left, which is a really good place to keep an eye on, I'm going to zoom in here, it says I've hit a breakpoint, right? That was exactly my intention. On the right-hand side, again, I am paused. So I'm no longer paused at the entry point, I am now paused at my breakpoint. That's great, that's exactly where I need to be. Now I'm in a position where I can determine and assess what's happening. What is these state of this program? I could look at the register thing.
Muted.
Pushes represent arguments, and when a value is pushed, it's actually being pushed onto the stack on the bottom right. So when I look at this call, I can then look at the stack to understand the arguments, and what you'll see here is that one of the arguments appears to be gus.ini. So I have proved now that the program is opening up gus.ini. Now I got a question here I wanted to answer. I'm just reviewing some of these comments here. I got a question from Steve that says, how does fopen relate to the create file operation we saw in procmon? Does procmon translate? Yes, so what's actually happening is oftentimes when you see an fopen, for example, there will be a translation that occurs in the background, and it will actually call another Windows API call. So this is a fantastic question. So procmon monitored and captured the create file operation, but that actually happens in the background of fopen. So procmon is monitoring at an even lower level, and it's catching the API call that is called as a result of calling fopen. So thank you, Steve. That's a great question. All right, so we have proven that gus.ini is being read, and that's fantastic. That was our first goal. But now we want to understand what's contained within that file. So our next step might be, well, to start looking around a little bit, right? I'm searching for that next step. I'm not exactly sure what to do as the analyst. I might start looking below. I'm scrolling down a little bit here. I'm looking for things that, well, I might recognize. I come upon this call to scanf. Now, you may not know this to start off with, and for that reason, you may choose to then Google it. But scanf is actually a program that can be used to, well, scan a line from a file, right? It can read a line from a file, basically. But it requires some information to do that. It requires a format string that specifies the format of the file that it's actually going to read. All right, the format of the line in the file more specifically. So as I look above, right, I'm looking at pushes when I see calls. I see this push. And OnlyDebug is kind enough to translate for me the ASCII string that is essentially being pushed onto the stack. This is in fact a format string that you can provide to scanf. And essentially, right, without getting into all the nitty-gritty, essentially what it's saying is, you know what, I'm looking, when I read a file, when I scan a line in a file, I am looking for something equals something. Now it's got some more specifics here that are frankly not important for this example. The point here is that it's looking for something equals something. Wait a second, that's really confusing to me, because if I go back to my gus.ini file, I'm going to open this up again. All right, I do not see any equals here. This does not match the format that scanf is looking for. So there's something going on here that I don't quite understand yet. But let's focus on what I know, right? You always start off with what you know. scanf is right here. This is the format string. If I scroll above, I know that right here was the call to fopen. So somewhere between this fopen and scanf, it must have translated that file. It must have decoded it, because apparently
Hey, Anuj, sorry to interrupt. You're not coming through on audio.
How about now? Can you hear me now? All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about that, guys. All right. So let's move forward. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. This lesson would have been far less helpful to you all if you could not hear me. All right. So just to repeat the last few sentences, because I'm not exactly sure when I kind of got muted out there. But what we do know is that there is a scanf call here, and up above there's a call to fopen. We understand the fopen opens gust-ini, and that scanf, by now it's in a position to actually parse the data using this format. Between these two lines are only two function calls, right? And function calls do stuff. So when I'm confused about a current state, I'm going to look for function calls because they are generally responsible for accomplishing big things. I see two function calls, one a malloc, and I could look that up and determine our malloc is responsible for allocating memory. That's probably not impacting this particular operation. And then I have this custom function. I know it's custom because, well, debug has no idea what it's actually doing. And so one approach to better understanding what this does is to, again, set a breakpoint, right? Breakpoints are very powerful in providing clarity because I can then determine that at this call, what's happening in memory. All right, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to set a breakpoint here, and I'm going to hit F2, my keyboard shortcut, right? An alternative, again, is to go to right-click, breakpoint, and toggle. And I'm now going to run the code again. So I am currently right here at 40366A, right? That is where my last breakpoint was set, and that is where I am currently paused. And my goal is to now hit this other call that I'm trying to explain. So I'm going to go to debug, run. I've now hit this call. But I want to clarify. When I'm at this call, when I set a breakpoint at this call, I have not yet executed the call. The next step would be to actually execute it. And so in order to do that, I'm going to go to debug, and I'm going to go to step over, right? When I hit step over, it's going to step over this call and actually execute it. You will notice when I do that a few things change, right? Perhaps you've paid attention to the registry and the stack. Let's take a look at the registers this time. You'll notice that EAX has changed, and by the way, changes are generally marked with red. The EAX register has changed, and that address, guess what's actually contained within it? A string that is Nick equals Mikey. Now that's starting to seem a little familiar. So perhaps this is the custom function responsible for actually decoding the data in gust-ini. This is what I'm going to do now. I want to hit this breakpoint again and again. I want to hit this point. But you know what? I set my breakpoint at call because I wanted to demonstrate the value and most importantly illustrate the importance of realizing that, well, when I'm at the call, I haven't yet executed yet. I'm actually going to reset a breakpoint on this move because when it hits the move, it's already executed the call. And I'm going to do a little cleanup here. I don't need this breakpoint anymore, so I'm going to click on it and hit F2 to remove it. I no longer want this breakpoint either. F2 to remove it. I'm going to quickly check to make sure if there are any questions. All right, looks like we're doing all right. And now I'm going to hit F9. Again, F9 is the cue to just run the program. If I hit F9, now if you were just paying attention to the left, nothing changed, right? But if you start paying attention to the top right, you'll notice each time I hit it, I'm seeing new strings. Hey, irc.mcs.net, I recognize that. Whoa, that is a new server. I don't recall seeing that before. That's another new one. Holy cow, there are a lot of servers in here. Now via behavioral analysis, we only saw one of these. I'm now performing code analysis to successfully decode gus.ini, and I am seeing tons of them. Right? So right now, right in the first session here, you are seeing the powerful value of code analysis. Anyone tells you code analysis isn't necessary, they're just not getting it. Because look at this, I am finding all sorts of indicators of compromise, all sorts of new domains that I got to now configure my IDS with that behavioral analysis did not show me. So this is great. This is incredibly powerful. And I'm going to hop back to the slides here. If you were to keep doing that, you would have come up with a number of other strings as well. All right, so let's drive home some of these points just to make sure we're all tracking. All right, so I did get a question here. Let's see. Is the value in ESI the key used to decode the string? So we're talking about the ESI value here, and it's got a bit of what appears to be gibberish here. So yes, that is likely the case. So you'll notice there are two arguments being pushed to this call that are appearing on the stack. One of them, if you were to check this one right here, this TE9, you would find that in the text file. But this ECB one, as you'll notice when I keep pressing F9, that appears to remain the same. So I think that's a really good theory that the ECB string is probably used as a key. So really good question there. Excellent. All right, so we started off our approach with AliDebug with a goal in mind. The goal was to better understand what was happening with gus.ini, right? What was contained within it, and to confirm at all that it was actually being accessed by the suspect program. One of the ways you can do this is after opening it up in AliDebug, the program, you can then hit Control-N, which brings up what's called the names window. The names window basically shows you dependencies, right? And those are technically stored in the executable in what's called the import address table. All right, if you've ever heard of the import address table or the import table, it's referring to the same thing that I was showing you. This import address table is incredibly powerful for giving you a glimpse into potential activity. So you can start looking at the functions and the shared libraries they're imported from and coming up with some really good theories about the activity of the code. Now in this particular case, we wanted to investigate whether or not it in fact was opening up gus.ini. So we perused our function list for a API call that is capable of opening files. In this case, we spotted fopen, which is what we used this time. We then went to references for fopen, which are on the bottom left of the slide right now. And we wanted to dig deeper into one of them, so we right-clicked and clicked on Follow in Disassembler. Now I want to be very clear. In this case, it happened to be the first call to fopen, but it could have been the third or the fourth. There's a lot of trial and error involved in malware analysis, and so you don't necessarily always know the next step. You just have to test it and see what happens. So it could have been the case that you had to follow in disassembler, several of these, set breakpoints, and wait for the one that actually opened gus.ini. After we found this particular reference, we wanted to better understand what was happening at that time, and so we set a breakpoint. By setting a breakpoint on a call, we need to remember that it's not yet actually executing that call. In this particular case, that was fine because we wanted to evaluate the arguments to fopen, and those appeared on the stack. I mentioned arguments are often pushed, and where are they pushed? Well, they're pushed onto the stack. The stack is like a stack of plates, so when something's pushed, it shows up on top. In this particular case, that allowed us to confirm that gus.ini was in fact the value or the file being opened. All right, so this was incredibly powerful to confirm one of our theories. Our next task was then to understand what was contained within gus.ini. We didn't necessarily know the next step, right? We kind of did a little bit of exploration. We looked downwards, and we noticed an scanf function call. At that point, we could have just Googled scanf. We would have realized that, hey, this thing is capable of parsing a line in a file, but it requires a format string. You could then view that format string as a push, right? Again, we're looking at calls and pushes. We looked at this push above. AliDebug translated that address to a ASCII string for us, and we realized that something was missing. There was a gap between the last state we had assessed when gus.ini was opened and this apparent call where it expects it to be in a something equals something format. Between those two calls, well, there's another call that appeared interesting. There was a malloc too, but we kind of ruled that out because we could have Googled that and realized that's for allocating memory, not very relevant to what we're trying to investigate. But there was here a custom call to some other address in SRVCP. So in order to understand what's happening at this point in time, breakpoints are a very powerful approach. So you could have set a breakpoint either on the call and then step, as we did, or you could set a breakpoint right after the call. Again, you right-click, you go to breakpoint, you go to toggle, or you can hit F2. And then we ran the code up until it hit that breakpoint. And we looked around for activity. In this particular case, we saw activity in the EAX register. The EAX register, as you'll learn more about next week, in next week's sessions, EAX register is often used for returns, meaning when a function is called and it processes some data, it often returns it, and that return is often stored in EAX. So in this particular case, it appeared that it was processing lines of gus.ini and then returning those lines, those decoded lines, into EAX. Had we run through this process some more, and I ran through quite a few of these breakpoints, you would have noticed many IRC servers, all of which could have been used for C2, all of which could have had their own custom channels. And hopefully the value of code analysis is really starting to become clear. Now, there's certainly much more work we could do, right? This is just a glimpse at some of the analysis you could have performed against srvcp.exe. I'm sure by now, and I think you guys are already doing a great job of coming up with questions, right? You probably have lots of queries that you could try and answer, right? What sort of commands, for example, does it receive? Am I capable of controlling it by logging into that particular channel? Why is it here? What's its purpose? Can I gather certain information that could contribute to threat intelligence so I could try and determine who was responsible for this? These are all things that you could start exploring by continuing to perform reverse engineering activities. So in this section, we've discussed quite a bit, right? We went over behavioral analysis. We also went over code analysis. We've talked about, most importantly, the process of performing these activities. Tools come and go, and we're going to introduce you to a number of tools that you can use immediately to start doing this sort of work. But what's critical for you to take away is the process. If you understand the process, you can use a variety of tools to accomplish those goals. All right, so that concludes most of the lecture for today. The rest of these slides in part 1, which is what we're focused on during this section, have to do with lab setup and validation. All right, so just to kind of confirm the few next steps that I would suggest you take, work through exercises 1.1 and 1.2 in the workbook. Those are going to allow you to set up your REMnux and Windows VM environments. There's lots of configuration settings, or at least that you need to keep track of, and so the workbook provides quite a bit of detail. It'll help you move through those in a systematic way. The goal is for those two VMs to be able to communicate with each other, so hopefully you should be able to ping one VM from the other. The workbook you'll find is a pretty important resource, right? I'm going to go over lots of exercises and demo them here. But as you're going through the exercises on your own, in order to really practice some of these skills, you'll find that the workbook contains an incredible amount of detail to help you get through them. Some additional notes on REMnux. We suggest that when you use the REMnux environment that you stay logged in as REMnux and not try to become root. There are certain environment variables that are defined in the context of the REMnux user that are going to be helpful for you, but of course you can sudo to root as necessary. If you want to change, for example, the keyboard layout, there are commands here that allow you to do that. And there's another slide here on renewing your DHCP list in case you're interested in, and if you want to transfer any files to REMnux, SSH is installed. You could launch that server in order to do so. So this concludes essentially the lecture portion. I would certainly appreciate any feedback you have. We are going to spend some more time together, and so any feedback you provide, I'll certainly do my best to incorporate that into upcoming sessions. I want to make clear that I am aiming for excellence when I show up here during these sessions. I want to make sure that you're really absorbing the content properly and that I'm delivering it in a way that you can digest. So if that's not the case, I would sincerely appreciate any detailed feedback you can provide, and I will absolutely look at that feedback immediately. I look at it generally every night I receive it, so that I can better perform the next time that we're together. Now, I think Steve here already included a link to the survey that should be in your chat, so that's what you would want to click on in order to actually provide that feedback. It is 8:26 now, and we technically are together for another half an hour, and so what I'd like to do now is encourage you to start setting up your environment, to start working through, if you haven't already, exercises 1.1 and 1.2 in the workbook. As you have questions, please either send me a private message in the chat, or feel free to just send it to the group, because if you have the question, others might as well, and I'll provide a response by voice. So thank you again for your time, and like I said, I'll be around for a while. If you have any questions, whether it's about the VMs or the class at large, what we discussed today, feel free to hang out, and I will provide any feedback you need. Thank you. All right, so we have a question here from Derek. So Derek, you're asking about how to take notes on what's occurring, how to get file hashes or copies of files and transferring them to other systems. So I assume I'm not exactly sure if you're talking about files in the context of the samples we're looking at in class, or you mean just generally when you're performing incident response. So feel free to clarify that if you don't mind. But in terms of taking notes on what's occurring, that's a really good question, and frankly one I don't think is asked enough. How do you actually go about documenting the work that you perform? People have different approaches to doing that. So certain teams of people, for example, if they're performing malware analysis or even forensic analysis together, they might have a wiki, right? A wiki where they'll kind of collaborate on notes. Some people will simply, if they're performing individual analysis, they'll just occasionally write things in like Notepad, literally using the Notepad, built-in Notepad program for their notes. Others will use, for example, like a Word document to actually track activity. Now on your thumb drive, I'm going to plug in my thumb drive here, so you might see that on the screen. On the thumb drive, we have a lot of extra files, right? Other files that simply support some of the work that we're doing here in class. So if you go under References, there's one document in particular that I find helpful. This is a template that I created a while back that helps me perform malware analysis. It not only serves as a place for me to document my notes, but it's also essentially a guide. So it's broken down into background, for example, like information, contextual data I want to record about a particular incident. Like, okay, this is the date I got it, the workstation I received it from, the file name, the location, any timestamps from the target machine. Then I go into static analysis, which is, as I mentioned, when we're trying to learn about the file without actually clicking it. I've split this up into not only certain data that I want to collect, but also the tools I often use and what I'm looking for. So for example, looking at strings is important. Specifically, I am going to use programs like Strings, which is on REMnux, Strings2, which is on Windows, Bintex, which is on Windows, and I'm focused on things like functions, API calls, domains, IP addresses, specific commands the malware might use, and even error messages that perhaps the developer mistakenly included in their code and forgot to remove. Right, I then move on to behavioral analysis, which is what we did today, where I double-click the sample and I try to learn about its activity, its file system artifacts, network artifacts, what it's doing in memory, and then I'll take some of that and even perform some open source research to see if there's anything I can learn from work that others have done, because at the end of the day you don't want to reverse engineer something that has already been analyzed by many other people. And then I follow that with code analysis, and you can see code analysis is definitely a little bit lighter here because, well, it's a little bit more of a creative process, right? It's hard to provide a step-by-step procedure to perform code analysis, but I do know that when I, for example, am performing static code analysis, I'm going to look at the strings and tie those back to specific function calls. I'm going to look at calls in general. I'm going to look at the flow of the program, and then finally I'll actually debug, which is also what I demonstrated today. I'll set breakpoints, monitor what's happening on the stack, look at the registers, and start putting together the picture of what a sample might do. And finally, at the end, I have a summary. So this is one document that I think is helpful for me, at least. Everyone's got a different approach, but this is pretty helpful for me as a location to document my notes and make sure that I'm not missing an important part of my process. So Derek, hopefully that answers part of your question. You also talked about the file hashes. We're going to talk a little bit more in the upcoming sessions about using services like VirusTotal. Right? There certainly are dangers in using them and uploading files to them because obviously you're giving your file to a third party. If you are part of a targeted attack, meaning that there is a small group of threat actors that have targeted your organization, and you upload your files to VirusTotal, they will be able to determine that that has happened, and you'll likely tip them off that, well, their attack has been detected. So you have to balance those risks as you perform analysis. You can certainly save some time by using VirusTotal, but there is the risk that the attacker will detect that activity. And so that's a constant balance that you need to try and strike as you're performing this sort of work when you consider doing isolated analysis within your organization versus kind of sharing that information with the public at large. All right, if there are other questions, feel free to ask. So I got another message here from Clayton that I wanted to answer. So Clayton's asking in the group, are there sample reports that are available so we can see how your findings are communicated to management or persons without the technical knowledge of analysis? So beyond the reports that we have here, Lenny has some templates online for how he would outline a report, but we don't have any actual malware analysis sample reports that actually look at a particular sample. So we don't currently have that available, although you might consider, for example, looking at blogs that actually analyze malware, but I think your question is getting at, you know, that high-level executive summary that you might actually pass off to management, and I don't have any links in mind that I can point you to. I can certainly take a look, but SANS, you know, on your thumb drive, we don't provide that level of summary. But that's an interesting idea. I think you know, I heard that request not too long ago, and that's something that might be worth including. So I appreciate that suggestion.